On this Thursday night, what some doctors call a triple-demic. The trio of viruses and the effect on children.
The pediatric world right now is experiencing what the adult world had experienced.
And what's making the tidal wave of cases worse. Defending the North.
Russia has gone from a competitor to an outright enemy.
The power play heating up in the Arctic, a Global News exclusive. Climate summit concerns. The flood of oil and gas lobbyists rattling nerves. And a debilitating brain condition common in our veterans.
I worry most about the soldiers who think they're okay.
A Canadian lab's mission to cure CTE.
Global National with Donna Friesen. Reporting tonight, Farah Nasser.
Good evening, and thank you for joining us. For the better part of 2 years, Canadians managed to keep cold and flu season at bay as pandemic measures kept people masked and distanced. But with restrictions lifted and social gatherings picking up again, this winter promises to be different. Canada's top doctor is warning of a potential triple threat of illness, a collision of COVID-19, influenza, and RSV.
Respiratory viruses do come around every year, including influenza and RSV. The pressure on the health system right now is because these viruses may be synchronized in terms of the timing. So that's quite different from the last couple of winters.
But unlike COVID, RSV is surging among kids, and half of the influenza cases in Canada right now involve children and teens. Add to that a shortage of children's over-the-counter medication like Tylenol. Dr. Theresa Tam says pandemic-like protections may once again be needed in the coming weeks, but some are calling for those measures to be introduced right now. Mike Armstrong has our top story tonight.
You know, I didn't leave his bedside for 2 weeks.
It was, Carrie Graham says, the most miserable period of her life.
Are you feeling better?
Yeah.
Thankfully, it's over. Graham's 3-year-old son, Tyler, was one of a growing number of cases of respiratory syncytial virus, RSV. She's sharing their story and some painful videos because she wants parents to know how serious RSV is and what to look out for.
If their chest clavicle area is breathing, if you can see the breath going through there or their abdomen, that's too much. They shouldn't have to work that hard to get a breath, and that's definitely when they need to be seen. And so lethargic that they're not like eating or drinking, obviously. You know, those are the symptoms for me that were like really shocking.
Now, one of the problems Graham hit was a lack of intensive care beds in her local pediatric hospital. Tyler had to be moved by ambulance 2 hours away. Well, that's a problem that's spreading. At the Children's Hospital of Eastern Ontario, they're already making decisions they've never had to make before. With their intensive care unit at 280% capacity, they've had to open a second unit to add beds, they're postponing some surgeries, and they're sending older children who need critical care to adult hospitals. Well, children's hospitals across the country are seeing a rise in admissions and shortages of beds, staff, and ventilators.
The pediatric world right now is experiencing what the adult world had experienced at the peak of COVID.
Now, it's not just one illness that's causing the problem, but 3 at the same time. COVID-19 is still around, influenza is growing, and RSV is soaring.
What we're seeing, I think, at the moment is a confluence of different viruses.
All 3 viruses are usually a problem. The difference this year is when they're hitting. Influenza usually peaks in late December into early January, and RSV usually starts in November. Instead, both are here early. Well, experts say it's likely because as life gets back to normal, people are gathering more and spreading viruses. But not only are there more cases, but with RSV, they're also more serious than usual. Children haven't built up any immunity.
Traditionally, prior to the pandemic, about 90% of children by the age of 2 had seen RSV.
Now, one thing compounding what some are calling this crisis is the shortage of medications that would normally be used to treat children, things like amoxicillin and children's Tylenol. If parents can't find them on store shelves, they're more likely to end up going to hospital. That means more admissions when doctors are dealing with more severe cases than usual and longer hospital stays. That's leading to a strain on the system, a lack of beds, and longer waits in the emergency room.
So, Mike, what is the government doing about these shortages?
Well, Health Canada said today it's approved a special importation of 2 medications. It's bringing in ibuprofen from the US, that's already here and being distributed to hospitals now, and it's bringing in acetaminophen from Australia, that's expected soon. There's also been talk of language on labels being a problem. Health Canada says everything is in place so that hospitals will have the labeling information in both official languages. Farah?
Mike Armstrong in Ottawa. Thank you, Mike. We've long been told the global climate crisis is reshaping our planet. It's impacting the way we live and ultimately how we should better look after it. But there's an extra layer of urgency in Canada's far north, where melting glaciers and sea ice are fueling a different type of challenge, maintaining influence and holding on to a landscape rich in resources. Russia's aggression on the world stage has renewed concerns about the state of Canada's Arctic defenses. Our Jeff Semple spent time on board a Canadian Navy icebreaker and brings you this exclusive report.
Margaret Brook Will at Transit Belt Strait.
Commander Nicole Robichaud has served with the Royal Canadian Navy for 2 decades, but neither she nor any of her 65 crew members have ever seen anything like this.
Margaret Brook went and poked our nose into the polar ice cap, just seeing the expanse of the Canadian Arctic. It was quite fantastic.
HMCS Margaret Brook is part of a new fleet of Canadian icebreakers, tasked with patrolling Canada's Arctic, including the full length of the Northwest Passage.
So we went to the northern tip of Admon Rings Island.
Sailing to the edge of the map, the furthest north that any Canadian patrol ship has ever dared to venture.
We know where the land is by grace of satellite imagery, but what's under the water is still very mysterious in some places.
The melting Arctic ice is revealing a vast network of uncharted waters, and the crew finds themselves in a tight spot.
Low-lying rock, we can see it red 10.
The ship, about the size of a football field, is attempting to squeeze through this narrow passage, just 1 kilometer wide.
If the strait had been somewhere like Vancouver Harbor, we would know exactly how fast the water was moving in what time and what direction. Whereas up here, we might not have any idea if there's 100 meters or 500 meters or 1 meter of water. You don't want to hot dog your way through a transit like that without doing the research and having as much prior planning as you can.
So it's all hands on deck, teams double checking their trajectory, while others scan for icebergs. Even for this Arctic vessel, ice that's more than 1 meter thick could breach the hull.
Sea ice moves very rapidly. Winds and swells and seas really play a part in where that ice goes and where we could see it next.
The Arctic is warming more than twice as fast as the global average, opening up new shipping lanes and revealing a treasure trove of natural resources. And there are fears that if Canada doesn't assert its presence and ownership of this region, another country will. Russia has been ramping up its military presence in the Arctic for years. Then in February, it invaded Ukraine.
Russia has gone from a competitor to an outright enemy, and the idea of an attack on North America has gone from fantasy to unlikely, but distinctly possible.
This Arctic security expert says if Russia were ever to attack North America, the shortest route would be from the North Pole. Canada's North Warning System, a chain of 47 radar sites from Alaska to Greenland, was built back during the Cold War to detect Soviet bombers. No match for Russia's high-tech arsenal of cruise and hypersonic missiles.
Which makes us very vulnerable because we really don't have the capabilities to be able to detect them, never mind intercept them.
There is a pressing need to modernize our continental defenses.
Last summer, Ottawa announced plans to build a new Arctic surveillance system over the next 20 years. Canada is also purchasing 15 new warships to work in tandem with its 6 icebreakers, including Margaret Brook.
And so whether it's Russia or any other country, they need to know that this is Canadian territory and their armed forces will enforce that sovereignty on behalf of Canadians.
Margaret Brook isn't built for combat, armed with just a single gun. But the crew believes their presence alone sends a message.
We are here to protect our northern waters.
Serving an important mission: to see and be seen. Jeff Semple, Global News, aboard HMCS Margaret Brooke.
As Jeff mentioned, the Arctic is warming at a rate more than twice as fast as the global average. So what's happening in a hot and dusty beach town in Egypt at the UN Climate Summit matters to Canadians. There, leaders from smaller, poorer nations have criticized larger, wealthy polluters like the U.S. and China and oil companies for contributing to global warming and demanding they pay up for damages. There are hundreds of fossil fuel lobbyists at the summit as well. And as Eric Sorensen reports, critics say they have far too much influence and are undermining true climate action.
Pay compensation! Pay compensation!
It is the biggest issue for many poorer countries and climate activists at this year's summit in Egypt, getting wealthy nations to pay for climate damage.
We want world leaders to take this agenda very serious because our future as young people is at stake.
Prime Minister Trudeau is not going to COP27 in order to attend other international meetings. Canada's Environment Minister, Stephen Guilbeault, concedes that this country must do more, that wealthy nations still haven't delivered the $100 billion in climate financing promised years ago.
It's become more of an issue because we are now seeing really severe impacts of global warming. The best that collectively we've done is promise to deliver by the end of next year.
The most visible participants at COP27 are world leaders and climate activists. But among the thousands of delegates are more than 600 representatives from oil and gas, a big jump from last year, according to environmental groups. And it's evidence, they say, that oil and gas lobbyists have too much influence. Some are part of Canada's 300-plus delegation.
Canada is an outlier in bringing several lobbyists to the climate negotiations as part of its official delegation. And we believe this is unacceptable and sends exactly the wrong message.
The oil and gas industry has maintained it must be part of the solution. For example, promoting carbon capture and storage. Skeptics say that still allows for more oil and gas production. Building trust is a challenge.
It would be easier to see the oil and gas industry playing a constructive role if they hadn't fought every domestic policy coming their way tooth and nail.
Le dilemme, c'est que nous dépendons. At COP27, French President Emmanuel Macron bemoaned the dependence wealthy nations have on fossil fuels. But France and Canada are among the nations pushing to overhaul climate financing. Many activists say rich countries should start by depending less on input from the oil and gas lobbyists taking part in the summit. Eric Sorensen, Global News, Toronto.
A rare weather phenomenon in November. Coming up, the hurricane that hammered Florida. Hundreds of thousands of people in Florida are without power tonight after being pummeled by a hurricane in November. Tropical storm Nicole slammed into Florida's east coast as a Category 1 hurricane this morning, packing a powerful punch before weakening. Torrential rain and winds of 120 kilometers an hour triggered flash flooding and cut away beachfronts. A state of emergency is being declared. Storms this size so late in the year are extremely rare. Nicole is the first hurricane to hit the U.S. in November in nearly 40 years. While former President Donald Trump is riding out the hurricane in Florida, a political storm continues to brew around him after his biggest midterm election bets didn't pay out. While control of Congress is still too close to call, the fact that it's even close is being widely seen as a repudiation of Trump's MAGA message. Jackson Prosco joins us from Washington with more. Jackson, when will we know which party controls the House and the Senate?
Hi, Farah. Depending which way Senate races in Nevada and Arizona go, we could have an answer within the next week, or we could be left waiting for the results of a special runoff election in Georgia in December. Control of the House may also not be known for several more weeks because there are still dozens of races that are too close to call in states where mail-in votes will take quite some time to count. Now, even without a final result, here's a sign of how disappointing all of this is for Republicans. We know that any Republican majorities will be slim at best, and there's still a scenario, albeit slim, where Democrats keep control of both the Senate and the House. Something like that is virtually unprecedented in a midterm cycle, especially when you've got rising inflation and an unpopular Democrat president sitting in the White House. Today, many Republicans are playing the blame game, and they're looking squarely at former President Donald Trump, who looms so large in this campaign. Of course, Trump selected and endorsed many of those Republican candidates who ended up losing. One sign of how conservatives may be turning away from Trump is the front page of the New York Post, which squarely blames the former president. And then there's an editorial in the Wall Street Journal calling Trump, quote, the Republican Party's biggest loser. Keep in mind, both papers are part of Rupert Murdoch's powerful media empire, which until now has openly backed Trump. So what happens next? Well, both parties will wait and watch for final results in the weeks ahead, and Republicans will likely start soul-searching. They have to decide if it's time to move forward with or without Donald Trump. Farah?
Jackson Prosco in Washington. Thank you, Jackson. U.S. President Joe Biden and his Chinese counterpart Xi Jinping will hold face-to-face talks next week, despite tense relations between both their countries, especially over Taiwan. The pair will talk Monday while attending the G20 summit in Bali. This is their first in-person meeting since Biden became president. Their agenda is expected to include trade matters, Russia's invasion of Ukraine, concerns over China's human rights violations, and Taiwan, with Biden expected to stand firm on America's support for the small country's autonomy. Stranded migrants rescued. Ahead, which European country is taking them in after days at sea? The Ukrainian military is steadily advancing after Russian troops announced they're pulling out of the strategic city of Kherson. It's the only major Ukrainian city that Russian forces had captured since their invasion began in February. President Volodymyr Zelensky says Ukraine is moving very carefully since it's unclear how many Russian forces are still in the region. Now, this move is seen as a major blow to Russia's military ambitions because less than 2 months ago, Russia unilaterally claimed Kherson as Russian territory. In Europe, France is allowing a ship carrying hundreds of migrants to dock after harshly criticizing Italy for shirking its responsibility. The Ocean Viking is operated by a humanitarian group. It has more than 200 migrants aboard. They are set to be welcomed into several EU countries after making landfall. The ship was one of 4 charity rescue boats carrying around 1,000 migrants and refugees. All were stuck in the Mediterranean off Italy for days because the country refused to take them in. France's interior minister slammed Italy's decision, calling it unacceptable behavior and selfish. Enlisting veterans for help. Next, the cutting-edge research into troubling brain disease. Physical scars are all too common among Canadian veterans returning home. But now, a group of former athletes, soldiers, and researchers is asking for veterans from any era to help them better understand the science behind their mental struggles. And what they need is for veterans to donate their brains. Mike Drolet has more on the research to uncover the secrets of the brain disease known as CTE.
The sounds of war never really leave a soldier. Anyone who's been on a battlefield knows you not only hear gunfire, you feel it too. Explosions can rattle even the most experienced soldiers and leave lasting effects.
There's a lot of head contact / brain sloshing around in your skull.
In all his years playing in the CFL and serving in the Canadian military, Ryan Carey escaped direct injury. But after he retired, he learned of the dangers of repetitive concussive blasts, and he struggled to feel like himself.
You know, I certainly felt like for years that nothing was working. And I felt like I was following everything, and you know, the challenge was just more and more medication, and nothing was working for me.
What he's learned since is that he's not alone. He's now running Project Enlist, which encourages veterans to donate their brains so researchers working away here in the basement of Toronto's Centre for Addiction and Mental Health can unlock new secrets of the brain. Using radioactive tracers, the team is able to pinpoint and study a broad range of disorders in the brain, everything from Alzheimer's to autism, among others. But their current focus is on CTE, chronic traumatic encephalopathy, common in war veterans and directly linked to depression and dementia. Today, the only way to diagnose it is post-mortem. They hope tomorrow will be different.
Absolutely, that's our goal. We want to be the first center in the world to image CTE in live.
How close are we to being able to see CTE in live humans?
I think we're much closer than we've ever been.
These unpublished scans, shared first with Global News, show the brains of 2 living Canadian soldiers. The brain on the top has had little exposure to concussive blasts and looks normal. But when they scanned a brain with years of exposure, they were able for the first time to see a higher concentration of a protein associated with CTE. It's groundbreaking, but not a definitive diagnosis yet. To get there, the team needs more data, more funding, and more brain donors. Project Enlist helps donor candidates register online, anything to support those in need.
Most about the soldiers who think they're okay, think they're fine, but they know deep down inside that they're walking on thin ice. And any day, they could fall through.
At least now the work is being done to try and catch them. Mike Drolet, Global News, Toronto.
Tomorrow, in part 2 of his story, Mike is going to introduce us to another veteran who's traveling across the country, talking to his peers about the challenges of CTE and the push for Ottawa to step up funding for research. That's Global National for this Thursday night. I'm Farah Nasser. Tonight's Your Canada is the National War Memorial in Ottawa. Donna Friesen will anchor our live coverage of this year's Remembrance Day ceremony in the capital. It all starts tomorrow at 10:30 a.m. Eastern, 7:30 Pacific, right here on Global and globalnews.ca. Until next time, take care of yourselves and each other. Good night.